We're continuing our series, Why I Do What I Hate. And we've been talking specifically about anger and how to deal with anger. And really the goal is not to manage anger. We said in a couple broadcasts ago, the goal is to find out, what does anger indicate? We talked about in the last television broadcast 4 different ways or strategies to deal with anger. One is to suppress it, push it down on the inside, put it under the cork in your bottle. Another way is to repress it, which is push it down so deep you can't even remember it, it's unconscious. A third way is to express it, which is you just blow anger out all over the people around you. And a fourth way is to confess it, or what I call emotional breathing. You want to speak all the anger out to the Lord, and then you want to receive His truth afterwards. A couple broadcasts ago, I said, anger is actually not the problem, it's the indicator of the problem. So the issue is, what does anger indicate? What does it indicate? It's like a red light in your car. It doesn't do you any good to try to manage the red light. You want to find out, why is that red light on, solve the problem, and the red light goes out when the problem is solved. Anger is exactly like that. So the management strategy for anger, short term, is emotional breathing. Express out, confess the emotion to God, and receive God's truth. But ultimately what we want to do is find out, what is anger indicating, and remove the thing that it's indicating. When the root problem is solved, the indicator light doesn't come on anymore. So what does anger indicate? There's a very, very powerful force underneath anger, and this is really the root of almost all anger. This force that we're going to discuss on a broadcast today is like a spiritual or emotional AIDS virus. What I mean by that is, if you have AIDS, if you have an HIV virus, you don't die of AIDS. Do you know what you die of? Almost anything. Why? Because what does that AIDS virus do? What does the HIV virus do? It attacks your immune system, and it begins to debilitate it and destroy it to the extent that you can't throw off. You have no immunity to very simple things. So people that have an HIV virus working on the inside die of they can die of flu. They can die of a cold. They can die of anything that a healthy immune system would normally throw off, because their immune system isn't able to cope with simple viruses and bacteria, that sort of thing. Well, what is an emotional AIDS virus, an emotional HIV virus? It's when your immune system has been attacked on the inside, emotionally and spiritually, to the point that you're not able to bounce back from very simple rejection, from very simple types of spiritual and emotional attacks. When this AIDS virus gets on the inside, this powerful force that I think is at the root of anger, it just begins to debilitate and destroy the emotional and spiritual immune system, to where people can't retain joy, they don't retain relationships. They're like a cracked vessel where the water leaks out, and this thing is a powerful, powerful force on the inside. The force that I'm talking about is the force of shame. Shame. Now, you may be surprised to hear that shame is at the root of most anger. And I think the reason most people are surprised at that is because they don't really understand shame. There's a huge difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is the feeling, I made a mistake. Shame is the feeling, I am a mistake. There's a huge difference. See, guilt is a wrongness of action. Shame is a wrongness of being. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Can you see how dooming that is? If I made a mistake, if I did something wrong, I can repent. I can be forgiven. I can change. I don't have to do that wrong thing again. But if the wrongness is my being, not my action, if I am something wrong, I can't repent of me. I can't cast me out. I've got to live with me for the rest of my life. So shame is a deep, deep sense of wrongness of being. Shame is a deep, deep wound on the inside with a lot of fear of death, identity death, worthlessness, I have no value. Do you know that shame will turn people into human doings instead of human beings? The reason I say that is somebody that's carrying shame on the inside feels like I have to perform better than everybody else in order to be of any value. People that are carrying shame may not be what you would typically think of somebody that has low self-esteem. They may be hyperachievers. They may be strong leaders. A person carrying shame may be somebody that's over the top in their performance. And the reason that is because there's that deep feeling on the inside, if I don't perform perfectly and if I don't do better than everybody else, I'm worthless. That's the feeling of shame on the inside. It comes when we're little children, and shame is rooted in anger. Shame comes by and large when people are controlled. So if you grow up in a family where you have a father and mother want to control everything, control your actions, have everything be perfect, never make a mistake, do everything right, the reason that shame gets on the inside is if I do anything wrong, there's a feeling like I'm a worthless person, and that gets imputed to me by dad and mom. I have no value because I'm not perfect. So shame says I can only be valuable if I'm perfect. So I have to do everything perfectly. Now, here's the problem. It's human nature for us to love other people exactly the same way we love ourselves. So if I have to be perfect to be valuable, what does that say about people around me? That means you also have to be perfect in order to be valuable in my sight. So what happens if you make a mistake? If you do something wrong? Or if you sin? Then you're worthless. And I will convey to you condemnation, judgment, worthlessness. You did wrong, you horrible person. And I impute shame to other people if I'm carrying shame. You know the very sad thing about shame? It's transgenerational. What I mean by that is parents who carry shame inevitably will impute shame to their children. They will transmit that shame right through to their children. And one of the primary external mechanisms through which shame is imputed is anger. So because I carry shame, I have a standard and expectation in my own heart. I have to be perfect. I want everything to be within control, everybody to do what they're supposed to do around me. They all have to control everything. And when anybody makes a mistake, anger erupts. And I express anger and worthlessness toward people and impute shame to them. Let's look in Hebrews chapter 2, and let's find out the opposite of shame. Here's what I want you to know. God never intended for shame to come to anybody. Shame never comes from God. Now, guilt is a mechanism that God put in your life. Guilt is supposed to be there as a part of your conscience because guilt lets you know you did something wrong. You wouldn't want to go through life not knowing if you made a mistake or if you did something wrong, would you? No, if you do something wrong, you'd like to know about that so you can repent, so you can ask forgiveness, so you can correct that and not do it wrong the next time. So guilt is a good thing. Guilt lets you know you did something wrong. Shame is not a good thing because shame is, when you do something wrong, guilt says you did a wrong action. Shame says you are a wrong person. You're a screw up. You're a failure. You're worthless because you did that thing. So many times guilt is translated right into shame if we're carrying that on the inside. And when I've got shame on the inside, it's going to manifest in lots of anger toward people. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 6. But one has testified somewhere saying, what is man that you remember him? Or the son of man that you're concerned about him? You have made him for a little while lower than the angels. You've crowned him with glory and honor. So God created us to be crowned with glory and honor. Do you know what the opposite of glory is? Shame. What is glory? A feeling of intense value. What is shame? A feeling of intense worthlessness, lack of value. Shame and glory are opposites. Honor and dishonor are opposites. So God created you to be crowned with glory and honor, and the devil's purpose is to clothe you with shame and dishonor. These are opposites. It says, you have appointed him, speaking of man, over the works of your hands, and you've put all things in subjection under his feet. For in subjecting all things to him, you left nothing that is not subject to him, but now we do not yet see all things subjected to him. So we see in verse 7, God created us to be crowned. It says that God has crowned us, man, with glory and honor. And the devil is busy trying to crown us with shame and dishonor. So glory comes from God, shame comes from the devil. Honor comes from God, dishonor comes from the devil. Now, the interesting thing is, in a family, parents can be agents of God to impart glory, value, honor to their children. Husbands can be agents of God to impart glory, honor, value to a wife. Or husbands, parents, wives can be agents of Satan to impart shame, dishonor. Here's an amazing thing. In some families, when a child makes a mistake, I remember hearing this many, many times, not in my family, fortunately, but in many other families, parents would say, "Shame on you." Well, here God is doing everything He can to get shame off people, and parents are busy putting shame on their children. So shame creates a worthlessness of being, and it creates a perfectionism on the inside. I got to do everything right. I got to do everything perfectly. I become a human doing instead of a human being. No rest because I've got to perform in order to be valuable, because there was an impartation that came to me. Unless you're perfect and you do everything right, you are absolutely worthless. So how does shame get in the life of people? How does it get there? And anger is one of the primary reactions to shame. So when I was saying anger is a warning light or an indicator, what does anger indicate? It indicates almost always shame is in the heart. And when the shame is removed, the anger, which is a work of the flesh, subsides. Shame is just a deep type of fear of death on the inside that torments and torments and torments the soul. So how does it get on the inside of children? We're going to look at that right after this break. You know, most people don't realize that shame is a significant root of anger. And many people that struggle with anger, they try everything to try to control that anger, to stop that anger. But you know what I've discovered is this: as long as the shame is there, anger will manifest. People keep trying to control it, but shame is a deep fear of death, which has been imparted way down on the inside of the soul. So how can you tell if it's there? When you hear phrases like this, "There's no place like home," do you smile, wince, gag, or panic? If it's any of the last three, you probably grew up in a shaming home. Do I feel like I got to work twice as hard as other people in order to accomplish half as much? Do I feel like I'm the only caterpillar in a butterfly world? I've got to work and life just comes easy to other people. That would definitely be an indicator of shame. Now, how does it come? Primarily two different ways. Shame comes, number one, when I'm not allowed boundaries. Boundaries are violated. Shame comes when people violate physical boundaries, verbal boundaries, they scream and yell at me, emotional boundaries or sexual boundaries, that imputes shame. Shame comes to little children, and it usually comes in a family when we're little. One way that shame comes is when there's a disruption of experience. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're a little girl, you come home from school one day, and every day you're used to coming in the back door, putting your books on the kitchen table, walking across the kitchen, going to the refrigerator, maybe getting a glass of milk and a cookie and sitting down and eating it. One day you do what you do every day. You come home, you come in the back door, you put your books down, and as you're walking across the kitchen floor on the way to the refrigerator, this angry voice screams at you, "What's wrong with you?" And this hand reaches out of nowhere, grabs you by the black back of your top and pulls you across the room. And you're thinking, what did I do? And your mother is screaming at you, "Can't you see I just washed and waxed this floor? You're tracking mud all over it." Well, as a little girl, how would you know that your mother had just washed that floor and waxed it, and now you didn't know that? And see, she didn't tell you. There wasn't a sign. She just expected somehow you would know, but because you didn't, and you're a little girl, she grabs you, screams at you. That imputes shame. It's just a sudden, something's wrong. I must be a horrible person. I'm obviously, I'm a bother. I'm a nuisance. I shouldn't be here. My presence is what the problem is. See, it's not really anything you did. It's your existence that's causing the problem. So sudden disruption of experience, violation of boundaries, that'll impute shame. The second thing that imputes shame, and this is even more common, being held accountable for things that are beyond your control. So when you're a little child, you're held accountable for things you don't know, things you can't do, things you can't control. That imputes shame. Classic example is this. Suppose your family goes to somebody's house for dinner, and you're 5 years old. And your mother says before you go into the house for dinner, you say, "Now, Johnny, be a good boy." What does good mean in a shaming family? What it actually means is perfect. Good is a code word for perfect in a shaming family. So when mom says, "Be a good boy, be a good girl," what does that mean? That means when we go into this house for dinner, you're 5 years old, remember, what mom actually means is don't do anything wrong. Don't yell, don't scream, don't cry. Don't knock anything over, don't spill anything, don't break anything, don't bite the other little boys and girls, don't wet your pants, don't have any kind of needs, don't disrupt anybody, and most of all, don't embarrass us as parents. That's what be a good boy or good girl means. Now, you're 5 years old. Is it possible that that's going to happen? No. What's going to happen? You're going to bite somebody. You're going to spill something. You're going to wet your pants. You're going to get in a little argument or fight with one of the other little boys and girls, and you're going to embarrass mom and dad and make them feel like bad parents because you're 5, and the expectation is they want you to behave as though you're 25. That's not possible. So you're being held accountable for something absolutely beyond your control. Why does that impute shame and not guilt? Because when you spill something, or you bite the other little child, or you do something wrong, mom and dad then impute to you, you're a worthless person because you did that. So when mom and dad are carrying shame, they have to be perfect. As a child, you're an extension of their identity, so you have to be perfect. So when you're not perfect, you're an embarrassment to them. You stir up their shame. They feel like bad parents, and their way to respond to that is with anger. Anger comes out and makes you feel more worthless than they do. And that's a cycle that repeats. So if you get a bunch of shame in your heart, then you have to be perfect. Everybody around you has to be perfect. And the cycle goes on from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And people end up doing the very thing they hate because of the shame. Do you know, I was reading in one book, and I believe this is true, that shame is the root of almost all addictions. Shame is the root of almost all abuse in families. Shame is the root of most adultery and most abandonment. Now that's very, very interesting. Shame is at the root of that, and the root of shame is a deep, deep fear of emotional abandonment. The root of shame is if I don't do everything perfectly, they're not going to like me, they're going to reject me, they're going to abandon me. Again, let me give you a very simple example of how shame comes to little children. Suppose you're going on a family vacation. You get in the car and you're driving to maybe a beach place or a place of vacation. You're heading off for a day or two in the car, and as you go, you and your brothers and sisters are playing maybe in the back, and you get a little bit loud, a little bit noisy, and Dad says in an angry voice, "Would you kids shut up? You're making me crazy." Well, even just that word, "you're making me crazy," he just made you responsible for his emotional well-being. In other words, Dad is not okay. Kids, your presence, your acting like children makes your dad crazy. Well, suppose you don't discontinue, you continue to be loud and a little bit noisy. Suppose Dad gets a little bit distracted, tries to turn around and yell at you again, and runs off the side of the road and hits a rock, punctures a tire, finally stops the car, and he turns around, and what does he say? golly, we've punctured a tire. Isn't that sad? Probably not. He turns around, you kids, look what you've done now. And he yells, his face is red. And what happens as a little child is like, oh, I just want to sink through the floor and die. Obviously, my presence is toxic to my father. I am the cause of all his anger. I'm the cause of all his problems. He would be much better off if I weren't here. That's the feeling of shame that gets imputed. And what was your crime? Acting like a 6-year-old, acting like a child. I remember one day when my children were young, I said to my youngest, Johnny, I said, would you stop acting like a little kid? And he looked up at me and he said, Dad, I am a little kid. And I said, oh yeah, I forgot. And I caught myself realizing I have an expectation that he should act like an adult, and he's not an adult. He's just a little child, so it's likely he will act like a little child. But in a shaming family, there's no room for mistakes. There's no, if anything goes wrong with parents, somebody gets blamed. Children get blamed. The wife gets blamed by the husband gets blamed by the wife. Somebody else is already blamed, always blamed. Nobody takes responsibility. And shame is imputed. Lots of anger flowing out of that shame. Lots of dysfunction in that family. And so if you grew up in a family like that, where you were controlled, everything needed to be in control, everybody needed to control their behavior, their thoughts, their words, everything needed to be perfect. You know, one of the code phrases, again, in a shaming family, they will say to children, only remember the happy times. Do you know when you hear that phrase spoken in a family, that is almost always a dysfunctional, shaming family where there's lots of things they don't want you to remember because they were unhappy, dysfunctional, sinful, devastating times. And a lot of shame was imputed. You know, the good news in all of this is Jesus Christ took shame upon himself. If shame comes by being blamed for something that you're not at fault for, then Jesus must have been shamed beyond measure, because Jesus was blamed for the sin of all humanity, and he himself was sinless, hadn't sinned at all. And yet he was held accountable and blamed for your sin, my sin, the sin of every person who's ever lived on planet Earth. And Jesus took that upon himself. He took shame upon himself that he might set you free from shame. Now, that is powerful. Now, a key thing that I found is that in a family where shame is operative, there are 7 key rules in that family. Now, these rules are not written on a refrigerator, but you find out about them if you're born or adopted into that family pretty quickly. And rule number 0 is, before you even start with the first 7 rules, rule number 0 is there is a rule maker, and the rule maker is always right by definition. Rule maker might be dad, might be mom, might be grandma, but whoever makes the rules in that family, that person is always right. So there is a rule maker. The rule maker is always right by definition. And then there are 7 rules in that family, and these 7 rules will ensure that lots of shame gets imputed into the hearts of children, and they grow up with that shame and manifest lots of anger in adult life, because anger is the external manifestation of the injustice of being controlled and manipulated and forced in areas and held accountable for things that I don't know, I can't do, that are beyond my control. So that these 7 rules are critical. We're out of time on the broadcast today to go through those 7 rules, but on the next broadcast, I want to share with you what these 7 rules are. You'll probably be shocked at what they are, because some of us grew up in a family exactly like this. And again, what we want to get to is the good part of how do I break the power of that shame and eliminate the anger that's functioned in my life. Remember, stand by the ways and see and ask for the ancient paths where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your soul.